Welcome to the Farm Show on Westplex Talk 1045 FM, the very last edition, the very final edition of the Farm Show here on Westplex Talk. I'm your host, John Combest. We are spread a little too thin in Combestville, and we'll talk about that in C Block today. But hey, you're not done hearing agriculture updates on Westplex Talk 1045. You'll still hear them during the Brad and John Show, which is every weekday morning, Monday through Friday, 7 to 8 a.m., right here on Westplex Talk. I'll be including agriculture updates in John's top three in the first segment of that show. So agriculture news is not going away from Westplex Talk 1045. It's just moving to Monday through Friday on occasion on the morning show. But that's not the point of A Block today. That's not the point of our first segment today on the Farm Show. Today, we're going to get right into practical advice. Now, with all due respect to my new friends in the beef industry and folks in animal agriculture, for the very final edition of the Farm Show here, I got to go back to row crop productivity. And more specifically, I got to go to my favorite agronomic show there is. And I'm going to be a bit of a homer. You know, I don't read my resume on this show, but for 12 and a half glorious years, I worked at Monsanto and then Bayer, and I got to work with some great agronomists, and one of them was the great Lance Tarchioni. He was frequently one of our speakers at things like the Farm Progress Show, and Lance is still one of the leading agronomists in Bayer, if not the leading agronomist. He works right across the river in Western Illinois. You can find Lance's series, Ask the Agronomist, by going to the DeKalb Asgrow YouTube page, Western Illinois YouTube page on YouTube. So without further ado, let's get right into the productivity pieces of Lance's latest Ask the Agronomist. I thought on the last edition of the Farm Show, let's go into something timely and useful for this time of year. Lance started off talking about planting seasons and planting dates. And from the chat, Lance says some folks were getting ants in the pants about getting beans in the field. You know, we've had some pretty decent, pretty warm weather. A gentleman in the chat, I couldn't tell if Lance said Merle or Merrill. Was it Merle the Pearl or was it Merrill Lynch? I don't know. Maybe it was Merle Haggard. Ask Lance about potential dangers of planting too early, even when the soil is warm. Here's what Lance had to say.
I'm guessing somewhere. Nobody has told me. Well, I'll take that back. I do know of at least one bean test plot, not a whole plot, just like one pass in what will become a planting date trial. I do know of those beans that have been planted. I would guess somewhere in the state somebody's got a field planted. So if any of you are aware of any commercial acres of beans that have been planted, shout it out here in the chat this morning. But I mean, there's always somebody wanting to plant some beans, in mid-February just to see what happens. And we had a very good planting window. Was it about a week or 10 days ago in this part of the state? A lot of spring anhydrous went on under very, very good conditions. There was actually still frost on the ground. About 10, 12, 14 inches down, but the top foot was dry and dust was flying and looked like we were in a drought, which we sort of are. But I like a spring drought. Now, when a spring drought gets carried away and turns into a summer drought, that's not good. But I really hope we do not get enough moisture between now and planting to get out of. Just realized my hood's kind of messed up, so I need producer Heather here to tell me my hood's a mess. Anyway, would not be good if we get enough moisture to get caught up on moisture between now and whenever we plant, because that would mean we'll be planting in June, which nobody ever likes. But Merle's question about planting beans too early. So the first thing I like to remind people is I've never seen a planting date trial where February or March beans out yielded April beans. So I think there's a little bit of a misnomer when it comes to planting date and soybeans, that they just keep getting better and better and better and better the earlier you plant them. That's not true. I've never seen a trial. Somebody will probably find one somewhere to prove me wrong.
Okay, now for context, if you've never actually watched an episode of Ask the Agronomist, Lance usually has a whiteboard behind him. He did a little bit of a calendar and a graph to explain planting dates, and then Lance went on to talk about planting dates and yield results.
Typically, in most planting date trials, the highest yield you'll achieve with soybeans are planted somewhere in April. I've seen it be late April. I've seen it be early April. Often it will be more mid-April. There is no data to support the fact that there is a benefit to planting soybeans in Illinois before the 1st of April that I have seen. But you can argue that if starting in March gets you done by, say, April 20th, that would be better than starting April 15th and getting done May 10th, according to the data. So the danger to answer Merrill's question. So this is one thing that frustrates people about me. Merrill asked a good question. We've been talking about his good question for a few minutes now, but I haven't technically answered it yet. So we'll get to the answer. So planting beans too early, they're probably going to yield less than if you planted them in the optimal time. You've got more risk of losing them to a freeze, and you've got more risk of getting a good enough stand that you're not tempted to replant them and you can get good weed control. So, they almost always make it. There's stories out there of soybeans that were planted in February. Soil was frozen multiple times, frozen to a depth below where the seed is in the soil, frozen for extended periods of time, covered with multiple inches of snow, got wet, refroze, dried, re-wet, refroze. Took 60 days for them to come up, and they still got about a 60% stand. And a 60% stand, if you drop, anything over 100,000, it is a leavable stand. I wouldn't tell you to replant that. Now, the uniformity is not going to be good. And if you listen to Alex Harrell talk, who's the 218 bushel soybean guy from Georgia, he will talk a lot about the importance of uniform emergence in soybeans. Now, you and I, who have no chance in hell of ever raising 218 bushel beans, we don't care as much about that. We just want to make sure we got enough plants. But if you're trying to raise freakishly good beans, you need to have relatively uniform emergence. And when you plant that early, you can kiss uniform emergence goodbye. You're going to have beans struggling out of the ground over about a 3-week spread. And, you're going to have awful plant-to-plant uniformity. You're going to have awful seed spacing because you're going to have skips and gaps and areas of the field where they come up better than others. They're going to be very uneven. They're going to be very, not perfectly distributed. It's not going to be a good stand. But, through the magic that is soybeans, a piss poor stand of soybeans can easily yield 80 or 90 bushel if they're planted early and everything else goes right. So those would be the 3 risks to me of planting quote unquote too early. And the optimum window, I'm going to say, is sometime between early April into the first few days of May. It's not like, May 1 is not a cliff that you fall off of. The difference between May 1st and May 5th is going to be, relatively insignificant usually. By the time you get to the middle of May, you can tell more of a drop off. And as you get into later May and June, then there's obviously a steeper drop off. So you can find data that shows for each day of delay, how much yield potential you're losing. Dr. Belo, has that data from their trials, and other people have replicated that.
All right, from there, Lance went on a little more. We're going to skip ahead and talk about when Lance mentions corn.
So I think we got about 30 days to get our bean crop planted in a window that I would call is the peak planting window for soybeans. Corn's about the same, 30 days. Now it's shifted about 2 weeks later than soybeans, but we got about a 30-day soybean planting window and about a 30-day corn planting window to be in what I would consider to be optimal conditions. But you could have absolutely planted soybeans in perfect soil conditions if you ignore the calendar, if you ignore the soil temperature, if you ignore the weather forecast, if you ignore everything but the soil conditions. You could have planted soybeans in absolutely perfect soil conditions 10 days ago.
If you're just joining us, we're playing select clips from Bayer agronomist Lance Tarchioni. You can find the full discussion and the full episode of Ask the Agronomist by going to YouTube and looking for DeKalb Asgrow, Western Illinois. From there, Lance went on to give a little warning about planting too early and replanting options.
This on the corn side, for a lot of seed companies this year, the biggest risk a grower would face, planting their corn too early is if you have to replant, heaven forbid, you may end up replanting something that you've never heard of before or something that you haven't planted for 5 years, because the inventory of seed on the good stuff this year is super, super, super tight. So if you squander what you got the first time, a lot of seed companies offer free replant. We do as well. Insurance policies will pay you to replant. There's people out there that act like they're making good money replanting. Be careful with that attitude this year in corn, because you're going to get one shot to do it right with the hybrids that you ordered. Hopefully you got what you ordered. Apologize to those of you who didn't, but so that'd be not quite as much of an issue with soybeans, but some of the better beans are in tight supply as well. So got better second options there probably than we do on the corn side. But anyway, that's another watch out.
Lance then went on to give some pretty good insight about a program that Bayer calls Tech Connect, an internal meeting, and also an update on Viconic soybeans.
New products in discovery, new products that are nearing commercialization. So, we talked about things that you've heard of, like, Conventro and Viconic. We talked about things that you've never heard of, like Icafolin and F735, and stuff that has maybe some scientific names, or maybe a product name. Well, not a product name, but it doesn't have a commercial trade name yet. So for years and years and years, what's now Viconic we referred to as HT4, which HT stands for herbicide tolerance, and 4 was the 4th generation of herbicide tolerant products. We got an update on HT5 and HT6, at AgTech. So we get a little peek behind the curtain on things that are coming down the pipeline, things that are pretty near term. So Viconic would be very near term. We're hoping to launch Viconic in 2027, and yet to be absolutely certain that we will be enabled to do that. But looks promising at this point. If we have a Viconic launch in 2027, we will probably get clearance to sell those products about a year from now. So we do not anticipate having clearance in the 2026 growing season. So our seed production group that's going to be growing Viconic beans this summer to enable us to sell them in 2027, if that comes to fruition, is going to have to hang on to those beans and not let any of those go to the elevator until we get all those export approvals that we're waiting on. But our anticipation is first quarter of 2027, which technically the first quarter of 2027 ends at the end of March, right? If I'm doing my math right. So, some of you will be planting beans next year, probably before Viconic is approved. So, our 2027 launch, is going to be somewhat limited just because of the timeline and because of the uncertainty. But that is still our goal. And then the 28 planting will obviously be a lot more significant from an acre volume standpoint.
And before we go to break, I want to play a clip of Lance describing Bayer's work on artificial intelligence and how it might apply to agronomists and why they can't just throw everything into ChatGPT.
But we talked about something we call ELI, which ELI is an acronym for our internal AI. It's an agronomy AI tool. And they're not, there were some agronomists out here that thought, we're getting replaced by a smart thinking computer. But that's not really the intent of it. But it is a tool for if you're out on the road and you got your iPad with you and you want to look up something. We can't really use the commercially available AI tools that are out there. I mean, there's a ton of information out there, and places like, and I don't use any of these, but I know the names. So like, what is it? ChatGPT, I think it's called. There's other ones out there. I mean, we got, I'd hate to be a teacher these days trying to figure out did the kid write this paper or did some AI technology write this paper? And there's lots of ways to get things done these days that I'm not sure you're learning anything, but you are getting things done. But anyway, we can't really just give all of our internal proprietary data and information on products to a public site like that, because there's things that we need to keep secret from our competitors, and all the companies struggle with that. So we develop these internal tools so that we have access to tools like that are safe for us to put all of our information in, so that it's not easy for a competitor to get stuff that we don't really want them to have. So we had an update on that. I've been a slow adopter to that technology. I will admit, it has gotten better. And if you're familiar with those with those type of platforms, they talk about you need to train them. So you have, the computer's kind of like a kid, doesn't know anything when it starts, and then over time, it learns and soaks up and absorbs information. I think there's an episode of Star Trek where where something that was built to absorb information, kind of became somewhat of a god and was, controlling the universe because it had amassed so much power and so much knowledge. And then there's a pretty popular movie series with Arnold Schwarzenegger called Terminator that is kind of along those same lines. So I like to point things like that out when people get excited about this, because we're making machines that can learn. They made a movie about that. It did not end well. So watch what you're doing there, smart people.
That's a great warning, Lance. I do like to get a lot of AI knowledge and insight from Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. When we come back, part 2 of Ask the Agronomist with Lance Tarchioni, highlights from that discussion. You are listening to the very final edition of the Farm Show on Westplex Talk 104.5. We'll be right back.